Today I'm going to be talking about when to replace your fencing mask. Your fencing mask is an essential piece of equipment. It keeps you safe, obviously, and it takes a lot of wear and tear. So over time, you do need to replace them. But the question always is, when? Ideally, in a perfect world, and when money is never an issue, as soon as your fencing mask takes any kind of damage, you should be replacing it. However, I know that that's not always feasible for everybody. And I am not saying, here's a disclaimer, that you should ignore damage and keep using a damaged fencing mask. Not at all. When it's damaged, you should be replacing it. If the entire integrity of the mask is compromised, that's when you need to replace it without any question. So what kinds of damage are we looking for on a mask that indicates that we should probably consider replacing it? Usually when we inspect masks, we're looking at the mesh on the front here, looking for major dents around the face. Other times we're looking at the seal around the mask here and looking for any separation. Other times we'll be looking at the mesh panel on the back, looking for separation here. Sometimes we'll be looking at the tongue being a little bit too loose, something that's not able to actually have the mask fit snugly on your head. A lot of times people don't actually look inside the mask for damage. So in this case for mine, what I'm going to do, pull this apart, lift up the tongue, and I want to inspect all of the padding. I want to look at the rivets on the inside, make sure that any haven't come loose or are sticking out. That's the kind of thing that'll happen when if you take a hit on the head and something's loose, it might cut you on the inside, and that's extremely uncomfortable. In my case here, I actually have a tear on the inside liner right here on the side. Now that tear ends up completely compromising the suspension of the mask. So when I put it on, it sits on my face and everything seems normal until any motion or contact from the front ends up pushing the whole mask into my face. And that's because that front liner is torn. When that front liner is torn, it's not able to suspend the mask here and stop the motion. So I have no choice but to replace it. And this mask in particular does not have a replaceable liner that I can just buy a new liner and insert it. The whole mask has to be replaced. I also have some damage on the back here, along the back rim, where you can see the steel has been exposed, it's starting to rust, and it's actually created a very sharp point. And if that gets driven into my head, then obviously that'll cause me some injury. I have another mask here. This one is older. It is a retired mask and has since been replaced, so we don't use it anymore. But I wanted to show it to you because it's actually a really great example of damage. So from the front, it looks pretty good. There's no dents or anything up here on the face. The seal is still intact and it's not separating. However, you can see here, this back mesh panel has started to separate, and there are now a lot of sharp edges right where the mesh is exposed, and it started to warp. That becomes a big problem. You can get cut on the mesh. It also just doesn't absorb impact correctly when there's no structure to this whole point here. So this mask ended up getting scrapped and needs to be replaced, obviously, which it has been. The other thing to consider is the tongue. So the tongue of the mask, there we go. You can see it starting to separate right here. Now, this in particular is not necessarily something that'll stop the mask from functioning well. If all you have is just a little bit of a tear on the tongue, the whole mask itself is actually still in pretty good condition. It's still usable, but it is something to maybe keep an eye on in terms of having stuff that's exposed, sharp edges, things like that. As long as you can still bend it and it stays snug, then that's okay. So here I have another example of a retired mask that has been taken out of the studio floor. Nobody's allowed to use it, it's been replaced, but I do end up keeping all of these masks, if anybody was wondering, because it ends up being a really great target on a Pell, but also it provides really good examples for my students for what to look for when their masks start getting damaged and when to replace them. So in this case, the mesh on the front is all good, no big deal. The back here is still attached. The problem is the seal right here. So you can see that it started to separate away from the mask, and the mesh itself ends up pulling away from the mask. And that's just this is probably the most egregious example of this kind of separation I've ever seen. And it's very dangerous, obviously. The entire mask is compromised, and you could never use this for anything ever again, other than maybe target practice on a Pell. So again, checking that the seal here is nice and snug, it's still glued down, there's no gaps, there's no holes or anything. And on a good mask, the seal, you can actually just peel a little bit with the fingers, and that's normal, as long as it's not separating and the mesh is coming up or the glue has been ripped out or anything like that. So you'll know when it's not good. So here I have a different brand. All the other ones I've showed you so far are AF masks. This one is actually a PBT historical fencing mask. The components are pretty much the same, and I'm still going to look for the same kind of damage on the inside of the liner, anything that compromises the suspension, looking at the snugness of the tongue, making sure it hasn't come loose and gets kind of floppy. Mesh, seal, all of this stuff is good. In this case, this mask needs to be retired. And the reason for that is because all of the dents on the front of the mesh are very, very significant. And maybe it doesn't show up super well on camera, but it has at least three dents in it that are about an inch deep, and that's too much. That's where you start getting the warping that can start putting your face in a little bit more danger, and how the mask sits on the face, how it shifts, where it might push in on the high points of your face, like the forehead and the cheeks or the chin, and that's not what we want. It's actually a huge bummer in instances like this, because otherwise this mask is still in really, really, really good condition. There's nothing separating, there's not even any rust on it or anything. It still looks really good. And so it's kind of heartbreaking when you spend a lot of money on a really expensive mask, especially something like this PBT 1600 Newton bib mask, and they get chewed up. They're tools, and so that's always unfortunate, but that is the reality. In light sparring, I would still maybe be okay with my students using this for maybe boffer sparring or foam sparring, just to keep their face from getting incidental contact, but I would never use this for steel fencing, ever. It's just, there's too much risk, the integrity of the mask is sort of gone, and it is a real bummer. So as an additional note, I usually tell my students to buy masks that don't have built-in overlays, like this one. Now, that's not to say I don't recommend these masks. They're really great. The overall protection is really good. The built-in overlay means you never forget your overlay. You never lose your overlay. There's always an overlay. However, the one downside is that it is very easy to overlook damage on these masks because you cannot remove these liners. They are riveted in. And so, unfortunately, you have to be very, very, very diligent about getting your hands underneath the overlay and checking for separation of that seal, or checking for dents, anything that feels significant. You can peel them back a little bit, but what you're not able to see is up here to see if there's any of that separation. And so that's why I don't really like these very much. For that reason, is just gear maintenance and making sure everything is safe. The most I can do is try and look from the inside and see. And for the most part, this one's actually still in pretty good condition, thankfully. But these get overlooked all the time. And the trend going forward for tournaments is to make sure that masks do not have significant damage before you go into an event. Another detail to keep in mind is rust. Now, rust doesn't pose an immediate concern for safety, but over time it will weaken the mesh, and that could be a point where the mask is more likely to break at that point where there's rust. And rust shows up most commonly on the front of the mesh, right in here, and mostly concentrated down on the lower portion, and that's obviously from just breathing, excessive moisture coming through and getting caught and getting trapped, and over time it just ends up developing there, and you can see it. Now, that's a lot of the reason why these masks and the mesh itself is coated, is to prevent rust. But over time, swords end up scraping it, they'll remove some of that coating, and that's where it becomes susceptible for rust. And there are things you can do to clean it and to sort of reduce that, and I strongly encourage it. I really, really, really don't like seeing masks that end up being super rusted in the front, because that's just one that's poor maintenance. And I try not to judge people too harshly on that. It's poor maintenance, and like I said, the integrity over time will be compromised. But it's not an immediate problem. It is something that you can take care of on your mask, and you don't necessarily need to replace it right away if rust starts developing. Another consideration here is the bib of the mask itself. So you always want to just check the bib and make sure that the integrity of that fabric is still there. Sometimes thrusts can get caught, and as they get caught, they'll tear the fabric, and then once that fabric is torn, that integrity is compromised and it is no longer safe. So with all of that said, I really hope this was helpful in trying to determine when you need to replace your mask and what things you should be looking for in terms of maintenance and when to replace it. Obviously, I need to replace mine, so I'm off to buy a new mask. Thanks for watching, guys.